Okay, we are here to celebrate the release of the brand new Pod Bible magazine, issue 21, our June issue, and we're here not only with Scroobius Pip, but also our cover stars, Hannah and Suruthi from RedHanded. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for having us.
No worries. How are you both doing?
Very well, thank you. We just got back from holidays, so we are just getting back into real life, really, and trying to kick a pretty aggressive salmonella infection that I picked up, so all good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
We're
not good.
exactly
Well,
the same. I've been right as rain.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope that recovers nicely. Yeah, that's weird, isn't it? Because you're having to get back to real life, but also kind of going on holiday is getting back to real life because of the 2 years we've had kind of thing. So it's a load of real lives. But how have you found kind of returning to podcasting in a post-pandemic world? Because I find it particularly fascinating with a podcast like yours, where you're trying to find the dramatic and intriguing stories, but you're now having to find them in a world where almost everyone's life is dramatic and intriguing at the moment, because it's been such a weird few years. So yeah, how's all that been?
I think we were very lucky in that when the pandemic happened, we really didn't skip a beat, because up until very, very recently, we always recorded separately, because when we started the show, we both had full-time jobs and we lived really far apart. So like right from the beginning, we were like, this just isn't going to work. We're not going to find the time or the space to be in the same room every week. So we devised several different ways of doing it. For the first few episodes, we were quite literally under duvets in our bedrooms, talking into Tascams. And then we were like, we can't do this anymore. We're going to get like severe back problems. So then they're called ISO-Voxes. They're designed for singers who need to record without being heard, and they just sort of like go over your head. So we both had one of those. And then we would stitch it together in the edit, reasonably successfully, we think. And then, so when the pandemic happened, we didn't have to rearrange. We didn't have to change the way we were doing things. So we were extremely fortunate that even though almost everyone stopped listening to podcasts when everyone stopped commuting and everyone had a wild panic, and the whole industry dropped by about 30% overnight and we all thought it was over, we didn't have to do that much of a rework. So we were really lucky.
Yeah, we were. And I think really during those 2 years of the pandemic and then coming out of the pandemic the other end, like you say, everybody's life was like so manic and crazy and interesting in certain ways. And I think that while there was that initial drop off of a few months, because I think we could compete with other podcasts and with music maybe, but we weren't able to compete at the very initial stages with maybe streaming. But then we saw people come back and that was really refreshing to see, possibly because we were able to continue producing content while maybe other TV production companies and stuff like that couldn't, because they couldn't get on set. So we were waiting with open arms with so much backlog of content that we'd created. And I think people were ready for it, because as interesting and chaotic as everybody's life seems to be right now, I think podcasts, particularly maybe true crime podcasts, because of the content we're covering, offer people a weird sort of escapism. And I think
totally.
people were here for it, and they're still here for it, luckily for us.
I was so sick of lockdown content. Did you see that? I can't remember what channel it was on, but there was that TV program over lockdown that was about lockdown fishermen, and it was just about these fishermen during lockdown and how they couldn't sell their fish. And I was living with my mum at the time because I was waiting to move into my new flat, and I would just be like, anything but the lockdown fishermen. I will literally watch anything else, because you're living it. You don't want to be reminded in the stuff you're watching that everything's fucked, especially not by fishermen.
I think you're right as well, and particularly as you guys were already set up tech-wise, there's going to be no drop in standard. One of the most frustrating things with, as you mentioned, kind of TV and streaming was the huge drop in standard that came as shows are going, it's okay, we're going to have everyone on Zoom. There's like, no, a panel show on Zoom isn't working. This is just awful TV. But the other thing that I think is perfect for you guys is your content and your stories are kind of evergreen. So when people were returning to that commute, it's not like a lot of those podcasts where, well, I'm not going to go back and listen to 3 months worth of people going, this pandemic's mad, isn't it? Kind of thing. Whereas with yours, it's these stories that they can go back. But speaking of going back and listening, I now want to go back and listen and try and spot the episodes where you've effectively got a box on your heads as you're
There are
recording.
hundreds of
'Cause
them.
I think
There
it'll
are
give a different
many.
feeling as a listener,
Yeah.
knowing that the two of you essentially had boxes on your heads.
And when we first moved into an office, we were sort of deciding how we were going to do it, and then setting up sort of a studio-ish setup like what we have now, but in a different space. And there was talk of maybe for a couple of weeks us having to go back in the boxes, and we were just like, we can't go back in the
Yeah.
box. Literally anything else but the box.
Yeah, we're very motivated to stay out of the head box.
No, never again.
I bet. We spoke to a number of different podcasters, obviously, during those lockdowns, and it was so funny every time I'd get on Zoom, before we were doing any video content on our YouTube, and just seeing the setups that people had. Yeah, there were a lot of duvets. There was a lot of sort of hiding in cupboards, all sorts of crazy things. Even I think Fern Cotton was doing some stuff under a duvet in those early days. People didn't quite know what to do.
It's the natural progression of the podcast.
Yeah,
Cupboard to duvet to head box to mic.
I know. I like the sound of this head box. I'm gonna have to look into it. I remember when we had you guys on the Pod Bible podcast a little while ago. It was, I think it was towards the start of the lockdown, obviously talking about, I mean, I love your story. I love the fact that you guys just set this up, the pair of you. You had other jobs. You just did it as a hobby, like so many of us, like so many podcasters get started in that way. And obviously it's gone from strength to strength, and it's now massive, and you've got loads of listeners. And you're consistently producing great content on a weekly basis. How do you manage to do that? Because obviously there are loads of cases out there. There's loads of stories to mine through. And I know that you tend to take it sort of in turns, in terms of the content, the cases you're focusing on. What is the secret to consistently finding good, juicy cases?
Oh, I don't know if there is a secret apart from we've always said this, whatever you're going to podcast in, and I'm sure you guys agree, just make sure you are genuinely really interested in it, because if you aren't, it's going to quickly become a slog. But even after 5 years, we've evolved. The content we're creating has evolved. The message we're trying to tell has evolved, but we're just so interested in true crime that we always feel like we have our finger on the pulse in terms of cases that we need to be covering. We've definitely become more brave as well in terms of covering more recent cases. In the past, we sort of shied away from that because we felt like, maybe it's too raw. And I think the other thing that's really happened is this evolution into going more down a political route. So talking about cases that have a particularly geopolitical stance on it, because one of the things we're really interested in, apart from true crime, is politics. And the audience's response to allowing us to be able to do that and evolve with us in that content development just allows us to stay fresh. I think if they were like, the only thing we want to hear is like husbands and wives killing each other, we would probably also get bored. But the audience is really to be commended for like how much they want to support our journey of exploring new types of cases. And I think over the last, I would say 12 months, we've really stepped into picking these cases specifically. So, for example, we're like, let's pick this murder of this journalist in this country so that we can talk about the Iranian Revolution or something as part of it. And our audience is super receptive to that. And it's allowed us to mix things up a bit more, I think. So when we're doing the content development, like meetings once every 6 weeks, we always say, right, we've got a micro, we've got a macro, we've got a micro. And it's like a familial murder, for example, to a big one, like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or something like that. So we just try and mix it up and stay interested.
Yeah, I think that we definitely have got braver with the sort of politics and stuff, but I think there are kind of two different types of true crime show. Like there's the conversational true crime show, which we obviously are, and then there's like the I am a man telling you a story and now you're asleep. And when we first started, it was one of the first stories we told was about June and Jennifer Gibbons, who's like an amazing story of these two girls who grew up in rural Wales, and they only spoke to each other in this like secret twin language. They burned a load of stuff down, ended up in Broadmoor. Anyway, there's a book called The Silent Twins, which was amazing. And we told that story, I think, on our second ever episode. And it's a very popular true crime story. A lot of shows had covered it. And we had so many people get in touch with us and say, we had no idea they were black. And it's such an important part of the story, which people shy away from because they don't want to get too political. But I think crime is inherently political, and it's very difficult to get away from that. And if you don't tell the story in the right lens, then it's a bit reductive, I think, sometimes.
I think the great thing about the conversational approach that you guys have is it also allows you to get interested and intrigued by the nuances, rather than only the big. Here's the big headline. Here's the story. And as you were saying before about genuinely being engaged and genuinely being interested, that's where that stuff can come out and come across and draw the listener in. I can't name the amount of the more I'm a man telling you a story type crime podcast where they've just gone over something and I'm like, that sounds mad.
Yeah.
And they've moved on and gone on with the story. I'm like, no, I want to know more about that. I don't care about that. I want to know that. And if there's two of you having a conversation, as you guys do, you can go, how weird is this bit? You know, we'll get back to the main thrust of this. But, I mean, speaking about engaging audiences, I think from a podcast point of view, you guys are a massive inspiration and kind of case study example almost of engaging audiences and using things like Patreon to really take your podcast to the next level, to be able to make it your job rather than just your kind of your hobby. So I guess how's that particular part of the journey been, from engaging the audiences to being able to provide them with the content that allows you guys to do this, you know, as your job?
I think for a start, we've been very lucky, and we've also worked extremely hard. And I think those two things often come hand in hand.
Yeah. And people always want it to be one or the other, right?
Yeah.
Rather than it being both hand in hand. It's either, oh, you were lucky, or yeah. But yeah, completely agree.
Exactly. So I think in terms of Patreon, we didn't start a Patreon for ages relatively because we kind of didn't really know why anyone would want to give us any money. And we were just always, from the absolute starting line, completely focused on the content. And we didn't know when we started. We just sort of offhandedly decided that we would do every week, and we offhandedly decided that it would be 8:00 on a Thursday. That was an extremely stupid decision just in terms of workload, and we really didn't know what we were getting into. But once we committed to that, like, consistency is the most important thing, and that's what we always say to, like, people looking to start their own shows, is like, pick your schedule and stick to it, otherwise people are going to drop off. So that was very important in, like, building our audience. And then once we got to, like, 6 months in, something like that, then our listeners were saying, hey, like, we'd really like to support you, can you start a Patreon?
And we were like, what's a Patreon?
Yeah, we were like, what's a Patreon? And then we sort of looked into it, made a lot of mistakes in the beginning, but sort of found our way through what we could logistically keep up with in terms of rewards, because the biggest thing on Patreon that people want from podcasters is access. They want more access to you as the creator, which means you have to put in more time, and obviously the more time you put in, the more money you make. But when we were still working, I think it was the second Patreon was making more money a month than my job was paying me that I was like, I'm out this bitch, I'm not doing this anymore. And then Suru had a big girl job, so it was a bit of a it was always going to be me that went first, and it really is just about consistency. That's how you grow an audience, and that's how you grow a listener base, and if they like you enough, they will pay for it. And I think there's, especially with British people are quite anxious about asking for money, but like once it's your job, like nobody works for free. Like nobody should have to work for free, you know?
Yeah, and I think actually the consistency, because Patreon is obviously like a really clearly visible way in which our audience engages with us so much. Even Patreon say to us, in terms of our listenership, to our conversion to Patreon is very high. So I think it absolutely is consistency in terms of delivering things on schedule, but also just Hannah and I from the very beginning, we were so obsessed with the quality of what we were putting out. We said, and this is nothing new, this is not a hot take, but we were always adamant that content is king. It has to be the priority over everything else. And, you know, the many, many late nights we pulled, all nights. I mean, during the 2-3 years that we were working full time and doing the podcast, we didn't see anybody.
No.
It was commutes to work, lunchtimes at work. Hannah used to edit the show in a shower cubicle at her office. I used to basically just not see anybody, evenings, weekends, anything. And, you know, the thing we always felt like, it was like we were in labor for 3 years, and now we finally have a bit of freedom, but kind of not, because we have this like out of control toddler who's constantly pulling on our hair. But that's what it feels like with this show, and it is our baby. But it was a difficult process. But I think the key to engagement, if anyone were to ever ask, or the key to growing your audience, which is what people always ask us, is consistency in schedule, consistency in content, and authenticity. There is no way that we would have the kind of fan base that we are lucky enough to have curated if we weren't being completely authentic the entire time. And I think not just Patreon, but things like the British Podcast Awards, the fact that we won gold in the Listener's Choice last year when we were up against absolute behemoths like Shag, Married, Annoyed, for example. It's because our listeners always turn up for us, because we turn up for them every week. And I think that's the best advice I can probably give.
Amazing. And I think authenticity is something, that's beautiful in podcasting, because it can't really be faked when you're coming back week in, week out, and you're not just, it's often an hour-long show or whatever it is.
Especially
you
when
get
your
found
friends
up pretty
listen
quick.
as well.
Yeah.
Because they'll be like, who are you pretending to be on the
what
podcast?
are you doing?
What is this?
Yeah.
What's that accent? Cool. Well, very shortly, we're going to ask you to open up the little tubes that we've sent you with your cover illustration done by Dan Evans, who has done every cover illustration so far. But before we get to that, I just wanted to ask you guys for a couple of recommendations. I know in the magazine we asked you what non-true crime podcasts you've been listening to. I just wondered what true crime shows got you into the genre. And, are there any of the big classics, or are there any little new ones that you've discovered that you'd like to recommend?
Oh, absolutely. We've got so many new ones, but I think the one that united us, because you guys know the story, we've talked about it on the last time we were on Pod Bible. Obviously, Hannah and I met, we didn't know each other before we started the podcast. We met at a party at Hannah's house where we got incredibly drunk and talked about the JonBenet Ramsey killing. And the podcast that we were both listening to, which at the time, I didn't really know anyone in London who was listening to podcasts apart from my dad. And we were both listening to Last Podcast on the Left, which is obviously a huge true crime podcast in the US. And I think that is the one that we probably bonded over. But since then, I think our favorites have become the ones that are the more serialized podcasts, where it's 10 episodes on one case, and you can just do a real deep dive into it. And there's some amazing ones being produced. I think one for me that was really, really remarkable was one called Hunting Warhead. And if people haven't listened to that, oh my God, I can't recommend it enough. It was mind-blowing, such good reporting.
I think Hunting Warhead is amazing. I think the one that I always bang on about, because I don't think anyone knows about it, especially here. It's an iHeartRadio production. It's called Root of Evil, and it changes the game. It's hands down the best serialized true crime podcast I've ever listened to. It's about it's about the Black Dahlia murder, basically. And this guy who is a very famous LA homicide detective, he's like, I'm pretty sure my dad killed the Black Dahlia. And he did.
Yeah.
So, it's amazing. It's incredible.
But warning, it is one of the most graphic podcasts I've ever listened to.
A lot of incest.
A lot of just horrendous things happening. And we've got pretty strong stomachs, considering the work we do. But I felt repulsed at points when I was listening to Root of Evil. So, warning. Wow. But definitely very, very worth your time.
I keep going back for more. I've heard it 6 times now.
That sounds amazing. Well, before we open, I just want to quickly ask, Suruthi, how close were you to starting a podcast with your dad before Hannah came into the mix as the other option? And how different would it have been?
Honestly, my dad would love to start nothing more than to start a podcast.
He'd love a little crypto bro podcast.
He would. Because I think back when podcasts were sort of first making their entry into the world, it was really because my dad's tech man. And I think it was kind of tech bros that were listening to podcasts. And he was always telling me listen to podcasts. And I was like, Dad, what the hell's a podcast? And I vividly remember saying to him, I don't care. And then I actually went traveling for a year. And then he was like, I think you should listen to some podcasts because you can download them. You don't have to use your internet up. You don't have to use your battery. You've got 27-hour bus journeys around Asia. You can just listen. And I remember the first ever podcast I listened to was a Game of Thrones podcast while I was traveling around Asia. And, he will forever be smug that it became my career.
He was also the first one out of all of us on TikTok.
He was the first one out of
Wow.
all of us on TikTok.
Yeah.
And
Morley Barrick slaying the game.
he is. He's a trendsetter. And I kept telling him, Dad, don't have TikTok on your phone. The CCP are watching.
Does he want a job at Pod Bible? Because this sounds, it's basically what we're doing all the time. Is he hard sold podcasts to you?
He did.
And,
He's
and
outside
made you
your
into
door.
a mega fan. So. I love it. Well, shall
Right.
we get on to the big reveal, lad?
Yeah, I
I'm
reckon
so excited.
So
Exciting.
obviously this image is slapped across 65,000 issues of Pod Bible that have gone out with the Sunday Times.
Oh my God.
You guys get to have a look now. Will they end up framed in the studio? Who knows? Will they end up?
Oh, that's amazing.
Good reaction.
Oh my God, I can't get mine out of here. That is really beautiful. Wow. That is incredible. Wow. What an
Hooray.
amazing artist. I love it.
Good stuff.
So cool.
Oh, that's
we
so
love it so
sweet.
much. Oh my God, I'm going to cry.
There
Look
you
how
are.
nice we look. And the book's there.
Obviously, we'll be sure to send you out a few copies when the
please
actual
do.
Oh, thank
copies
you,
come
yeah.
in.
My dad wants one.
Especially
My dad
one
wants
for your
5.
dad,
Yeah,
He can find some new podcasts in
we'll
there.
get one to him.
Exactly. Oh, thank you so much, guys. This is absolutely beautiful. What a stunning piece of work.
No problem at all. And it's been a pleasure, as said, to kind of be talking to you guys and featuring you guys kind of along our whole journey, really, with Pod Bible. We've kind of been featuring you from our early days. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
No,
great
we
to have
appreciate
you
it.
as cover stars at last.
thank
Well
you.
deserved.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I think, you guys are doing great work because, like you said, you had us on Pod Bible like when we were just so tiny. And I think that often people in podcasting talk about supporting indie podcasts and pushing them to the top because we really believe that is the lifeblood of the industry. That's what made podcasting what it is. And I think that sometimes now that podcasting is getting to where it is, that the indie podcast can get forgotten a bit. And I really appreciate what you guys are doing at Pod Bible. So thank you so much.
Thank
you.
you for coming and chatting.
Lovely
It
way
was
to end.
perfect.
Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.